It's the TMZ Behind the Bar podcast with the TMZ lawyers, Jason Beckerman and Derek Kaufman.
On December 2nd, 2016, a fire broke out at a warehouse known as the Ghost Ship, I guess, colloquially, in Oakland, California. At the time of the fire, the warehouse was crowded with people there to see a concert. As a result, Derek, 36 people, at least 36 people, because investigators, I guess, are still rummaging through
combing
the
through the building.
Right.
Yeah, absolute tragedy, Jason. Yeah.
At least 36 people were killed. This warehouse, now, most of you are probably familiar with this by now, 10,000 square feet. It was the home to an artists collective.
Yeah, like a sort of a commune. They called
Yeah.
it the Ghost Ship, and they basically rented out a warehouse and turned it into a commune. I think only one working bathroom for about 25 people.
Yeah,
at any period
25
of time.
people who
To live there.
there.
That's right, during
and
the
then
concert, a ton of
hundreds
people.
more. You know, it was in effect, as you said, an unpermitted artist commune. Dozens of people lived there. Reports have surfaced that city inspectors had at various times over the last years.
Literally just 3 weeks before,
And
we're trying to gain access
We're
to it.
trying to gain
And
access
fine it
to
and
it,
cite it in
and they
various
were
ways.
turned away but didn't come back. It's sort of, you know, in the coming weeks, I think we can expect to see a series of reports come out about the city's, you know, honestly, their inability or failure, or however you might characterize it, to come back and get inside this premises and investigate what was going on there, because I can't believe it's that hard to figure out, to see people walking in at all hours. But who
these
knows?
these are people somewhat off the
Yeah.
grid of life a little bit. They're not. These are not the
point.
type of people who are registered voters, and you can
Good
count
point.
them up very easily sometimes.
But you can bet on these series of reports that are going to come out about those investigations, and for good reason. You know, there were no fire sprinklers in the building. Firefighters on the scene heard and saw no smoke detectors, apparently. The biggest thing to me, you know, there were all sorts of wooden pallets and everything. The biggest thing to me is there was no staircase between
was
the
a-
first and second stories.
Yeah, so this is a giant warehouse. I imagine it with very high ceilings, and all they had apparently was wooden pallets serving as sort of a makeshift staircase. There may have been one other staircase that was a little more official, but most of the people didn't die from the fire. They weren't burned to death. They fled upstairs on this makeshift pallet, which presumably burned in this massive inferno, and then died of smoke inhalation.
That's right.
The fire just burned, and this is an agonizing death. I mean, I don't want to get into too many details, but this is no way to go, right?
Well. To that point, they knew it was coming, and we saw this a lot in Orlando too, right?
the massacre, yeah.
People in the Orlando massacre, people texting their ultimate demise
From
to
the
their
bathroom.
families from the in Orlando. It was in the bathroom. Here it's in the second floor of, "I love you. I'm gonna die." You know, whatever they
As
might
he
have
was
said.
executing people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Orlando, that's what happened. And the same thing happened here. These people are saying this, I'm about to be consumed by flames or whatever it is.
It's a horrific nightmare. Virginia Tech was similar, where he was executing
Yes.
people. There wasn't as much texting because I
Yes.
think it was an earlier era, but
Yeah.
just horrific.
So today, Derek and I are going to look into what happened to allow this tragedy to occur, who's to blame, and really what punishments we can expect to see. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
Derek, break this down to us. For us. Who are the players that we should look at here?
Yeah, so usually, I wanted to say before we get into this, we usually bring a lot of levity to a
Yeah.
podcast. This is a very serious issue, so we're going to treat it with the appropriate gravity.
Yeah.
But here are the basic players, Jason. So obviously, 36 people died in this ghost ship fire. There was the warehouse tenant. He's been giving a lot of press, and that's a man named Derek Ion Almina. He's sort of a colorful, eccentric figure. He's been on the Today Show. In the aftermath of the fire, he tweeted, and I just want to read the tweet because he took a lot of flack.
Can
for
I
this.
interrupt you for
Sure.
one second? When you say tenant, he was the person with the contractual relationship with the landlord, right?
Correct. He leased the building. He was the tenant of the building.
And then did he sublease it out to the various people who were living there? Were they living for free? Do we know?
The details are coming out. What he seems to have done, what the reports are saying, is that he subleased it in sort of an informal way to a bunch of these people who lived on the commune for $300 to $600 a month. They got to live there, and there was maybe one functioning bathroom and maybe 25 people at a time living in this space as an artist commune. And
I've heard about this kind of thing
resting it.
before, in this sort of communistic style of living, where people pay what they're capable of paying.
Sure.
And it's very much on the honor system, and it's a way of living. It's not your and my preferred way of living, but good for them.
But as you say,
anyway.
he was the one in privity with the landlord, in the contract with the landlord, so he was responsible for paying the rent each month to that landlord.
Got it.
And he collected, presumably.
Sorry
from
for
everyone
interrupting.
else.
I just wanted to clear that up.
No problem. So he tweeted in the aftermath, shortly after this fire, that the death toll was rising. He said, "Confirmed. Period. Everything I worked so hard for is gone. Everything I worked so hard for is gone. Blessed that my children and Micah were at a hotel safe and sound. It's as if I have awakened from a dream filled with opulence and hope to be standing now in a poverty of self-worth." So a lot of people interpreted this as him being overly
thankful that he had lived through this entire
thankful
thing.
that he lived through it, that his wife and kids were safely in a hotel, and that he and sort of focusing too much on his loss rather than the loss of life, maybe the loss of his artwork. So he took a lot of flack for this. He's been on a bit of an apology tour on the Today Show, but he's one of these figures who's somewhat colorful and poetic, as you can see, but maybe misplaced in a lot of his sentiment.
In a little bit of fairness to him, because I was as outraged as everybody else
Sure.
when we heard these comments initially. In fairness to him, you know, in the moments of a tragedy, people say things they don't necessarily mean. I mean, we give a lot of latitude to people who say things when they're not in the midst of a tragedy, and I think it's a little bit harsh to really jump on this guy who, from what I've seen in front of the press, he is not skilled in front of the press. He doesn't know how to formulate a sentence in a very diplomatic way, and I think he maybe just got caught up. I do believe that is suffering from this tragedy.
I couldn't agree more. There's no doubt in my mind that this man didn't want this to happen. He's not a malicious kind of person. He's sort of an artist, and like you said, I think of it sort of like the fog of war. When you're in the midst of something, you don't really think that clearly, and so maybe he could have taken the words back or said them slightly differerently. But in any event, he's the guy who leased that, and someone came out afterwards, and she's not a huge player in this, but her name's Shelley Mack, and we did a story on our website, and she was a former resident, so one of the people who subleased from Derek Ion Almina and lived there, and she described this place in horrific terms. She said it was a dump, a death trap with squatters, no safety equipment, no fire extinguishers, staircase that was makeshift, all of these details that you're hearing about what the inside of this place looked like, and there's a few pictures of showing the artist commune. She described it in horrific terms and said that she actually would express some of these things to Derek and said, this place is in shambles and it's really dangerous. It's a death trap. This is going to harm people. And he would laugh it off and said, look, this is a commune. We're not worried about these kind of hazards. We're here for an open and artistic space. So sort of dismissive. And I think that's led to the narrative that Derek Ion is taking a lot of heat for, that he turned a blind eye to some of these things. Now, the other big player, is warehouse owner, the landlord of this place, is a woman named Chor Ng, and last name just NG, no vowel. Right. So she's a landlord. Not much is known about her. She hasn't been out in front of this in the press. Derek Ion's been on this tour in the press, but she hasn't said anything. She apparently owns 11 buildings in San Francisco and Oakland, the Bay Area, and owns this warehouse and leased it to Derek Ion. That's basically what we know. She leased it now as a business, apparently, not as a residence for artists, and he just sort of turned it into this artist commune.
Yeah.
So those are the players. Now, who's going to get in trouble, Jason? This is what I'm most focused on.
So let's start from the top down. I mean, there's two different levels of trouble, right? One is criminal liability, which actually can be jail time for this kind of thing, and the other is civil liability. Can you be sued? And the answer to both is yes. There is both criminal liability that will likely attach both to Derek, the tenant, the primary tenant, and to the owner, the Ng family. I guess Chor Ng, I think, said something through her daughter, through a translator. Mm-hmm. She doesn't speak English. I assume she's a resident of the Bay Area, but we're learning more about that. She owns 11 buildings. I think you mentioned 11 buildings. That's my guess.
That's what I've seen in reports. And like you said, the criminal liability, there's an upswell of outrage, and that puts a lot of pressure on a prosecutor, right? I mean, the DA is going to get a lot of pressure to do something about this.
There's a lot of pressure, but you know what? In this case, I think Chor Ng is looking at substantial risk of substantial jail time here. You know, from what I've seen, and this is just none of this is confirmed. It all just happened a few days ago, but it does appear that there had been dozens and dozens of complaints made against this building. Landlords are by definition on notice of these things. You have an obligation of a landlord to know what is happening under California law, to know what is happening in your building, to ensure you make a warranty of habitability. It's a term lawyers use all the time, that the landlord is affirmatively obligated, not just in response to complaints by a tenant, and probably there were no complaints by this tenant, but you are affirmatively obligated to ensure that your tenants are living in a safe environment.
You have a duty.
You have a duty to these individuals to ensure that. Now, that duty was not just avoided here; it was flouted. Right? There was no acknowledgement of that duty for years and years, and that's why. What was the woman's name? The former tenant's name?
Shelley Mack.
Shelley Mack. That's why what she is saying is so important, because she's talking about what happened many years ago. And now we know what it was like now. So it's not like Chor Ng can say, well, I inspected it 6 months ago or 4 months ago, and circumstances may have changed. We know what this has been like.
That's exactly right. Look, Chor would have a better shot, it seems like, if Chor were blindsided. That this tragedy came about. She had a tenant who she talked to 6 months ago and then started running an artist commune. That's an entirely different case. This building, from all the reports I'm reading, was on the brink of being a condemned building.
That's
literally
right.
boarded up.
That's right. And there were complaints date back as early as 1998, most recently the point you made earlier, on November 13th and 14th. City building inspectors visited the property on November 17th, but they left. There have been dozens of visits, dozens of complaints issued. Chor-Ing would have had to put her head literally in the sand not to be aware of these complaints. And if she did that, that is no defense to the criminal liability that will come her way as a result of this.
Now, Jason, just before we leave Chor, how mitigating is it that, I'm assuming that she leased the space, a warehouse space, to Derek Ion, what I'm reading, as for a business purpose. Are the standards different? I know for warranty of habitability for a residency, it's different than what you need to have for a building that you're just working 9 to 5 in.
The standards are certainly different. You don't have an obligation to people sleeping in the residence, but you do have to have working smoke detectors. Sprinklers are more important often in a criminal building. In an office building, in a commercial building than a residential building. These sorts of regulations are in place to protect people's lives. The lack of a staircase between the first and second stories, to me, is a factor that will result in Chor-Ing getting jail time. That factor alone, the lack of a staircase, that's not a new thing. That is a condition that has existed for months, if not years. Not only that, at some point, Chor-Ing has got to have sent somebody by to see what's happening with this space. It's implausible to me that she had no awareness of what was taking place there. What Chor-Ing was doing was, in my view, based on what I've seen out there in the public, was collecting a rent check every month very happily and turning a blind eye to what was actually going on in this space.
We call this, I used to call it the ostrich defense. Literally just head in the sand and not worrying about what goes on and just getting the mailbox money that you're getting from Derek.
That's right.
That's criminally liable
That's
at times.
criminally liable.
And now a lot of people have died, and there's a lot of grieving families that are going to want.
And look, we're not breaking new ground here. There have been many, many prosecutions of landlords, either similar to Chor-Ing, who are not involved, and some more actively involved in the space, that are criminal liability based on the deaths of people from fires and the like that have broken out. One of the most famous examples was the station fire back in December of 2003. The band Great White was playing. I know.
Oh yeah, Once Bitten, Twice Shy.
That's right.
Yeah, I never listened to that song the same way again.
Well, back in 2003, there was a pyrotechnic show that was put on by the band's manager. It resulted in a fire that broke out. 100 people were killed in this fire. The manager who put on the pyrotechnic show, unpermitted indoors pyrotechnic show, was prosecuted, served 11 years in prison for that. Yep. The owners as well, one of whom was involved and one of whom was not involved, had no real knowledge of what was happening in this place, they were both nevertheless convicted. The one that was involved served 11 years. The other one had a 3-year suspended sentence. Yep. So there is absolutely a precedent. And this goes, by the way, there are 100 examples. There's another fire in Chicago.
But this is a very famous one, I remember.
This is very famous. There are many, many examples of landlords, whether or not they're specifically involved in the operation of the facility, being held criminally liable for negligence, for wrongful homicide as a result of these kinds of acts.
Yeah, and you got to be grossly negligent. I want to point out, ordinary negligence is not going to cut it in the criminal context. You have to be seriously sticking your head in the sand and totally turning a blind eye to things to be held criminally liable. Different for civil, which we'll get into. But tell me about Derek.
Derek has,
trouble?
As much trouble as Chor-Ing is in, Derek is in even worse trouble because he was acting as a landlord, right? He was subleasing this space to 25 other residents. Now, one thing we don't know, or at least I don't know, Derek, tell me if you do, is whether or not it was any of these residents who were actually killed in the fire.
That's a great question.
Because there is a duty that exists between a landlord and his tenant versus a landlord and his customer, and that duty is much greater towards the tenant than it is to a customer.
That's a great question. My understanding is that Derek, I don't know that any of the tenants, the 20 to 25 people who live there, the subtenants, were actually in this party. What my understanding is that they leased it out to other artists to put on this concert. Now, there could have been some overlap. Some of the people who live there might be interested in that music, but I don't think that's what it was designed for.
Reports are coming out.
He went to a hotel with his family, so it's not for the same.
The decedents are being named. From what I've heard, there is overlap between the tenants, at least in the party goers. Whether or not among the deceased, we don't know yet. We will certainly find out shortly. But regardless, the liability is even greater, the criminal liability for your tenant, because your duty is more immediate to the tenant. But your duty to your customers who come in, who come in for the event, are also substantial. When people die as a result of a fire that is caused by lack of sprinklers, that is caused by, deaths caused by lack of sprinklers or failure to have a working staircase or a million other causes, right? When deaths are caused, you as the landlord, the immediate person who rented the space and opened the space up to the band and sold tickets for people to come in or charged admission, which he did in this case, you have a duty to these people to protect their safety. And when you don't, you are going to be convicted of that. Not just civilly sued. You are going to be convicted of a crime here. Derek's looking at some substantial
I think that's
time.
right, because like you say, to those tenants, that's their landlord. Derek is the guy they send the rent check to. So I want to make that clear that even though Chor owns the building, when you're renting from Derek. You owe your
we
$300
all
to
know the
$600.
term sublease. A sublease is equally legally effective as is a lease in the first instance.
Now, most leases, Chor, I don't know if they use a standard lease. Subleases are not authorized unless the landlord gives consent to the tenant. So he may have been doing this on a frolic and detour away from Chor.
I'm almost certain he was.
I'm almost certain he was as well, since it was understood that it was a business that he was running rather than. But regardless, the criminal liability is going to attach probably to both of them under these circumstances.
Talk to us. I mean, as silly it is to talk about money when there's so many deaths, there are a lot more plaintiffs, right? You have not only the people that died and the families of the people that died, you also have the many people were injured, suffered from smoke inhalation, had fear of death. The residents lost all their belongings, presumably. What kind of civil liability attaches to these individuals?
You're going to get an onslaught of wrongful death suits, is my understanding, because when 36 people die, those are 36 families that could potentially bring a wrongful death suit against either Chor or Derek. Now, one of the overlays I want to talk about really quickly is if the building is insured in any way, that's where you typically want to get paid from, because insurance companies have deeper pockets than someone like Derek Almina or Chor Ang, right?
Yeah.
I mean, usually you're going to carry some kind of insurance with your building if you're a landlord.
But the insurer is going to back out of this and say, look, we insure, but we expect our insured to properly maintain the building.
That's right. That's right. So that's what's going to make this really difficult. And what's sort of heartbreaking to me, because even though Chor owns 11 buildings, you know these types of landlords. If they own 11 buildings, it sounds like they're a rich, wealthy, landed person. Chor is probably not that wealthy, to be honest with you. 11 buildings, earning whatever rent roll she has and whatever mortgage she's trying to upkeep. It's not a certainty that she has that type of money.
Well,
and Derek certainly is not a wealthy man.
To that point, she's renting this enormous space in Oakland, right, and getting very little, I'm sure, in rent from Derek.
And it's nearly condemned. She's not addressing any of the maintenance concerns. Some of this could be that she's ignoring it and just trying to squeeze every last dollar. Some of it could be that she doesn't have the money to make these repairs and things like that. So putting all that, you've got Chor and Derek that are going to face these lawsuits. The premises liability is what you call it in the civil context. There's actually a California provision, and this was in Oakland. It's California provision, Civil Code 1714, which is the landlord is liable for negligent acts in managing the property. The party is liable, so Derek or Chor.
Right.
Except, there is a big exception, except when the injured person, quote, willfully or by want of ordinary care brought the injury upon himself. So that's actually in the statute. So if the person is doing something that is so reckless, even if they're on your premises, you can have a defense and say, this person lit themselves on fire in my house just because it happened on my property doesn't make me liable. I don't think you're going to... You may see that type of defense raised if you assume the risk maybe of going to a dangerous EDM concert that is packed to the gills, that has no fire exits, that has no staircase. You may see this as a way of sort of mitigating the damages for Chor and Derek, but I don't think it's ultimately going to be successful. Do you, Jason?
I don't.
I was trying to brainstorm ways that they could maybe mitigate their liability.
Here's what I think is going to happen civilly here. I think Chor is going to end up having to sell all 11 of her properties. I think her insurance company is going to be tacked with a little bit of the liability, and I think Chor is going to the extent that all of her assets are in this country and to the extent they are attachable, I think she's going to end up as an impoverished pauper.
I think they'll be liquidated. You'll see Chor maybe go into Chapter 7. You may see Derek go in, and you'll see...
Who knows what Derek has, right? Maybe he's got more than we expect. He was able to stay in a hotel that night. But his assets will certainly be depleted.
But what'll be interesting is if they liquidate, let's say she has 11 properties, and these 36 families, or some or all of them, sue... They're not just going to be able to collect the money from those houses. They're going to have to sell them. They're going to liquidate. That's a very long process, very legally intensive, where lawyers are going to get involved if there's bankruptcies. Chor could have a list of other creditors. Maybe she's behind on water bills and so forth. I used to be a bankruptcy lawyer, so the idea that they're going to stand in line and just collect this money, even if it were enough to compensate them, doesn't just work that way. So it's actually a really long road.
It doesn't work that way. You know, the one people that are happy by this, the lawyers who are lining up to take these cases.
Those 11 properties, a lot of those proceeds will go to lawyers.
All right,
that's it.
Yeah, sorry for bringing it down, but it's an important topic and one that needs to be addressed. And I think we have a few mail questions.
Can they be more upbeat than this?
Yeah.
All right, before we get into mail time, we can cut this out if you guys don't want to, but one of the other players possibly would not the 100% Silk, the record label that put on the event, be liable at all?
Parker brings up an interesting point. I don't No, I don't think that unless they did something negligently that they would have. You rely on the facility to look.
I agree with Jason. They leased the space.
Yeah.
They wanted to put on a concert. They leased a space. Do they have some duty to put on a safe concert for their? Sometimes you see artists sued and when they're putting on a concert.
Yeah.
But I think that's a considerably weaker lawsuit.
The one other thing. Thanks, Parker, for bringing this up. That I was reminded of is, can the city of Oakland be sued? And I think the answer is absolutely they're going to be sued. Whether or not they're liable or not is a different story, but they're going to be sued
for not condemning the building,
for not following up on these various inspections, for having all these reports of an unsafe environment and not doing enough about it. That I meant to bring that up earlier. They will absolutely be sued. Now they have cities,
and they've got a deeper pocket.
Municipalities have lots of defenses. They are not subject to the same duties and obligations that the rest of us have, and for good reasons. We don't want our tax dollars going to fight off these lawsuits left and right. But there are ways to sue municipalities, and you can bet they will be named as defendants in this lawsuit.
I think that's absolutely right. Now, they seem to be talking to the media, and you're seeing some of the groundwork laid that they were actually on top of this building trying to maybe condemn it or at least cite it heavily. And when I read these articles, I get the distinct impression that they're sort of making their case that they tried and people weren't there and they were unable to effectively do their job.
And just to finish that point off, there was a lot of mention in the paper that I was reading, in the press I was reading, that not only did they show up, but they remarked about how limited their rights are to just simply enter onto private space without going through a number of legal hurdles they didn't have time to enter.
That's right. And one more quick point I wanted to make is that the landlord, when you're suing them civilly, has both a duty to visitors to the property and to the tenants. You have to remember that when you own a house and you invite a guest over, if they slip and fall in your house, you can be sued by them.
Absolutely.
So you owe that duty to the concert goers as well as people who are actually living in the space.
Mail time, Parker. Save us.
Mail time. Remember to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com. First up is from David Grubber. Gentlemen, I love the podcast and I listen to each one. I almost jumped out of my seat when you said that anything in the Constitution can be amended. The Constitution actually prohibits amending two things. Doing away with the writ of,
Habeas corpus.
Thank you.
It's always the writ.
And changing the year from which it would be legal to prohibit the importation of slaves from 1808 to an earlier year. This latter, of course, is a dead letter.
Jason, you want to take this one?
So, David, first of all, thank you so much for being a good fan. We actually, when we saw this, Parker forwarded this email to us and with some sort of snarky,
like we missed the boat,
about how we missed the boat,
and how we got our JDs. I think there was a little bit like, what are you two clowns up to?
Yeah, but David, I don't think we read it the same way. I do think that it is very restrictive in the Constitution about how you can rescind habeas corpus. To talk specifically about habeas corpus, by the way, is the vernacular for getting the body.
Give me the body.
Give me the body. And the idea is that if you are being held, for example, in jail, that you have a right to get out unless you are prosecuted for a crime. That's the most obvious example of habeas corpus. And you will file a motion for a writ of habeas corpus.
Brendan Dassey, when your appeals have gone the wayside, the direct appeals, you go for habeas corpus.
Now, the Constitution allows for suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in times of war. Abraham Lincoln famously
during the Civil War
suspended the writ of habeas corpus. But I don't think that's ultimately the conclusion is right, that the Constitution precludes that from being amended.
And here's why we think so. The Constitution is a charter. It's a contract amongst the states, and they all signed on to agree to govern themselves in this way with a federal government. If all of those states, or 2/3 of them, decide to change that contract between them, there's nothing in that document that can't be modified. Now, I know there may be ones that are a little bit trickier. This 1808 banning the agreement from moving the date for importation of slavery earlier, which is dead letter because then in 1808 they said no more slaves imported. But it doesn't make coherent sense really to me to say that the states couldn't come together and say, we don't like that provision either. Let's just amend it. We'll all agree, 2/3 of us, and we'll bind the 1/3 who don't agree.
Yeah, so thanks again for the question.
But it's a great question. To get people thinking this way made me very, very gratified.
Yeah.
All right, next and last one is from Emily from San Jose. I absolutely love your show. It brings together my guilty pleasure of celebrity gossip with my nerdy pleasure of law and governance.
I love our fans.
I love this. Everyone's really engaged. It's great.
The other week, there were statements in your show stating that Trump could not take away citizenship rights or punish symbolic speech because of the Constitution and former Supreme Court precedents. However, if Trump wanted to make an executive order that made such things punishable and that instituted such punishments, wouldn't he just need a stacked court to rule against anyone trying to challenge his actions? You stated that constitutional amendments would have to be made, but I think there is But I think this is much more within his grasp than that, especially given the fact that he has won and may have won more appointments to the Supreme Court during his presidency. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
This is such
What a
fantastic
terrific question. Goodness, that may be our two best questions we've ever had back to back in the same show.
I think so, yeah.
So Emily, yes, you're absolutely right, and it was an oversight for us. He could, in fact, if enough justices of the Supreme Court retire or die over the next
and a lot of them are in their late 70s and 80s.
Over the next 4 years, he could appoint conservative justices to the court that would not have such a harsh, jaundiced eye at these flag burning provisions.
Yeah, look, Marbury versus Madison says the court is the final arbiter of what is constitutional, and if he stacks it with people who believe in his view of the Constitution, it's conceivable.
That is certainly, and I also believe that that's an easier route than amending the Constitution,
without question.
But one thing to keep in mind is the cases that Derek referenced in the last episode were decided in 1989 and 1990. In the last 26 years, the one really consistent thread we've seen through Supreme Court decisions is an expansion of First Amendment rights.
That's right.
Most notably, for those of you who follow campaigns at all, the Citizens United case, which declared that the giving of money to campaigns is equivalent to free speech, which overturned prior Supreme Court precedent. And all of the more recent decisions have all opened up the First Amendment to
symbolic speech and things that aren't actually uttering words. Exactly
right. And I think this is, so it would be a real course reversal for this court, even if it were, we have Justice Scalia's position to fill. We have Justice Ginsburg, who's long been rumored to be on the verge of retirement. You have Kennedy and Thomas
and Breyer,
all of whom are in their 70s, I believe.
Thomas is young, but yeah, relatively.
Late 60s, I think Thomas is.
Yeah.
So he might have an opportunity to, if he has an opportunity to appoint 3 or 4 different justices, yes, he could pack justice. If you use this as a litmus test, do you believe, I'm not going to appoint you unless you agree that flag burning is constitutional? Or, I'm sorry, punishing flag burning is constitutional.
But what you said is interesting. It's difficult to square with Citizens United, which are decisions that they presumably like. I mean, these are, so they're going to have to...
Conservative justices like.
Conservative justice, that's what I meant. So reconciling those two, and that's what the Supreme Court does. So you have the principles of stare decisis. They can be overturned, but that means there's a fidelity, a loyalty to precedent. You want to stick in the common law tradition to precedent, and so it builds on each other. So reversing an opinion is a very big deal.
Yeah.
The other issue I had with an executive order is, remember, when he gets inaugurated on January 20th, he's going to put his hand and say, I'm going to uphold the Constitution. Now, the executive orders are, you can wield a pretty vicious pen, but you're ultimately bound by what the Constitution says. And now the Constitution says not to do that. So if he tries to just sort of get around it and circumvent it with an executive order, that executive order itself may be unconstitutional. So that's that could be challenged.
And also, executive orders can immediately be overturned by an act of Congress.
That's right. They're not as powerful as laws, which are passed by Congress. That's why they're weaker. And when he goes in, he can just cancel Obama's executive orders. So it's not as perfect a way of solving his problem.
I don't like this very real sense that I have that our listeners know more about the law than we do.
I know. This is it was so gratifying to read this. I have to tell you, when I saw this email, I was like, wow, they're really listening and engaged and maybe smarter than us.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thanks Emily. And the previous commentator was
David Gruber.
David, thank you so much.
Emily have a last name?
No, just Emily from San Jose.
Very well, Emily
from San Jose. That might be your last name. Okay, guys, thanks so much again. As always, subscribe to the podcast. Watch us on YouTube. We really appreciate the questions. Write in as much as possible, and we'll talk to you
next week.
Lighter?
Yeah.
It's hard to get heavier.
It's hard to get heavier. Thanks.
See ya. Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episodes over here.